So what I'm going to do is talk you through the ways I talked about coercive control in 2 courses. One of them was my own course, and one of them was of a colleague who's a member of the working group and can't be here today, Julianne Lamont, who teaches an English literature course, which is not my field at all, so that was super interesting for me to kind of be parachuted in and talk about something I don't know a hell of a lot about. So this is the course I was teaching in first semester this year. It's an introduction, it's the second time I've taught it. It's an introduction to how the courts work, but for criminology students, you can tell from the Crim Code, not for law students. So I'm a lawyer by training, but I'm now currently in the criminology program, and so it's kind of understanding how the Australian judicial system works. And there's learning outcomes, and I've just kind of cribbed all of this from all the bits of slides we need to understand all that in all that much detail about how the courts operate, innovation in court practice, theory and research, and resolve presentations, etc. And this is the structure of the course. I start with the court system and pre-trial processes, and the trial and sentencing and appeals, and therapeutic jurisprudence, restorative justice, which you may or may not have heard of, Indigenous peoples. And then in week 10, in a lecture on family violence, I did a little bit on coercive control. And the point is, I could have done a lot more. I really should have done a lot more, but as a member of this working group, Carolyn was saying, well, can you stick it somewhere in your course? I'm like, I've got a pretty full course already, but sure, I'll fit this in somewhere. So that's where the coercive control bit got stuck in, and then there was another guest lecture meant to court. So I told them what coercive control was, and it's a bunch of things which you're now familiar with, if you weren't before. And I asked them whether they thought it should be a separate offence, and went through a little bit of this business of all the things that you're also now familiar with, and walked through some of those arguments about why it should or shouldn't be. What we didn't say earlier, by the way, is one of the biggest proponents of criminalisation in Australia is journalist Jess Hill. She had a 3-part series on SBS, which See What You May Do, which in turn is based on a book by the same name, and she did an awful lot to campaign, as we said there, a criminalised coercive control campaign, to campaign for it to be criminalised. She has since walked back some of the claims that she has made, as she's spoken with more Indigenous women in particular. Also really dominant in the narrative have been the parents of Hannah Clark, a woman in Queensland. She and her children were killed by her ex-husband. And I don't know if it came out really in what was said earlier, but what that does come out in our report, and coercive control is a feature in 99% of intimate partner homicides. But what's quite striking is that sometimes, this was the case in the Hannah Clark, it was sort of disputed, and of course no one's here to tell the story because she and her ex are dead, but often the homicide is the first physical act of violence, okay? The reason I say it's disputed is because there was coerced sex that was taking place as well. But they hadn't come to the assaults she had in hospital, so a feature of coercive control, and this is why the desire to criminalise it exists, is to kind of really make clear that these behaviours of really controlling people are problematic, right? So there are arguments for criminalising it. Here's an article from Kate and others saying we're not ready to criminalise it. Here's an article including an Aboriginal co-author, Peter Gillibrand, a colleague of mine, saying that doing so would disadvantage First Nations. So I've talked with the students through all of that, and the fact that the New South Wales provision is coming into place early in 2024. This was in the first semester this year, so a bit further into the distance, and the circumstances in which it will apply, and it hasn't really yielded many successful prosecutions, as I said, and case research. And the question for them is how will it impact on the courts? And then that's the provision itself, and we'll talk through that. So, for final assessment was an essay worth 40%, and students were to write up to write 2,000 words, and they could choose from one of 13 essay topics or choose their own topic. And because we had some prize money, they were told that if they chose this topic, New South Wales recently criminalised coercive control and other jurisdictions are likely to follow suit. What are some of the issues the courts may experience when dealing with cases of this nature? We also had that additional information. If you write this essay, you'll go in the running for $500 prize. And so out of the 114 students, in fact 22% chose to write their essay on this, and the marks range from the not so great, their pass, through to a high distinction. So that's what I covered in my courts course. I wish I'd allocated more to it, but there was a lot to cover in an already busy course. So for the English course, Julianne, a friend of mine, said, come and talk to my English literature students. And this is this course about Australian literature, Spirit of the Pioneers, history of the literature, not the story, the history of literature is on the accounts of strangers and strangeness, early Gothic writing, blah, blah, blah. Now, I was a terrible student in this instance because I didn't actually know the books that they were talking about. She just said, come and give this lecture. Right, so I learned a little bit about it from the students, so that was one interesting learning. But it was mostly so that they would have information to help them contextualise what they were reading in their English literature course. So these are the learning outcomes for their course, which, as you can see, is extremely different from the sorts of stuff I was teaching them. Here, Australian literary works, poetry, film, drama, race, sexuality, cultural difference, read carefully, which I always had done. And the main book they were talking about was this book by Christina Stead, The Man Who Loved Children, which is an iconic book of Australian literature, which I still haven't read, very long, I might add. Set in America, though, interestingly, about, as I learned from talking to the students, it's set in the 50s, a very oppressive, controlling father and his relationship with his children and wife. So, the content I gave them very quickly, I told them a little bit about me, and I played them a little video because I worked on the assumption that they had a lower baseline knowledge than my students, because we came to coercive control in the middle of a 1-hour lecture on domestic violence. And then very similar, right? Partly because, it's easy to reuse your slides. Where everyone was at, it was a little bit later, so I had things that had been developing a little bit in WA. And then I talked to them, partly because I had longer, I think it was a 1-hour lecture rather than 15 minutes in the 1-hour lecture, about the survey of Kate's that I mentioned earlier. So Reeves et al., Ellen Reeves was Kate Fitzgibbon's postdoc, where it was a national survey of 1,261 people who said they had experienced coercive control. And I'm not sure quite what definitions they used, but they were given a bunch of different kinds of behaviours. 97% said they experienced emotional, psychological abuse, verbal abuse, intimidation, humiliation, degradation, isolation, financial abuse, rules that impact on day-to-day living, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and threats to harm if not complying with abuse assault. So we went through all of that information. And then I gave them 2 of our 3 scenarios. So this was because it was happening in tandem with us doing our survey. So it was, in fact, we only had 2 scenarios at that time. In fact, it was partly why we developed the 3rd scenario. So it was actually a really nice opportunity to kind of have your research-led education and your education inform your research, because they were the guinea pigs for the report that we've just launched. So I haven't actually checked the wording of this and whether we changed the wording at all, but here's a scenario, for everyone to read it, which ultimately became the scenario that went into the field. And then we then flipped the gender. So I think we changed it from the mining industry to aeroplane industry, didn't we? Yeah. So they've got small kids. She's not allowed to return to work. He doesn't like her seeing friends and family. And then when he's home, they have to spend a lot of time together. He asks questions about who she sees. And her friends say he's always buying her expensive clothes. So it's, kind of like quite sort of controlling when he's around. He's not around much. And so these are the sorts of questions that we asked and that we've then kind of used in the class as the discussions around what do you think of these behaviours. And in hindsight now, knowing what we know about the 18 to 24-year-olds and the kind of age of, an undergraduate second year cohort, they were much more condoning than the general Australian population. Oh, not over the top condoning, but it was like, this is not great, but it just kind of happens, right? And then the second scenario was the parent-child controlling relationship, and that was particularly relevant because that related to the subject matter of the book that they were. These are not the specifics, but this kind of controlling. And that was really interesting to discuss because so much of that is around mores that have changed over time. What we now see as controlling in parental relationships was much more just conventional parenting in previous generations. And some of what's in that book, as I understand it, is very much what we now call coercive control, and some of that would have been, I think, seen as beyond the normal behaviours of the time, and some of them would have been actually kind of acceptable behaviours of the time. So a lot of this is very socially determined, right? In a way that breaking someone's nose is less likely to be. So she keeps track of his whereabouts. She demands that this adult son, 20-year-old son, tell her when he arrives at work and leaves, and she calls him during the shift if he does not check in. Causes friction with his supervisor. He can't go out on dates or socialise with his mates. He wants to move out and live with friends, and she accuses him of abandoning her and threatens to harm herself. He's also trying to save up money to move before to move out, but she has his salary paid into the bank account and then pays him a small amount each week from that. And this was also a female perpetrator, a female controlling party. So we wanted to test that out. And again, those questions. Similar subject matter, obviously, taught in a slightly different way for a cohort who don't have much understanding or couldn't have a presumed understanding of the criminal justice system. So I learned quite a bit from teaching it in the context of discussing it in relation to a book, not least because I haven't read the book. It was really interesting to students. The literature students were really into the conversation. It wasn't like it was sort of difficult to engage. Now, obviously, there's going to be a limit to what sorts of topics you can have it with, but clearly music was a way of engaging. Maybe organic chemistry, less, I don't know. But I certainly someone who's only ever really taught criminology and law, it wouldn't have been innately, I wouldn't have innately thought that English was going to yield as rich a conversation as it did. I assumed probably too much knowledge in the courts course. That was kind of an error on my part, and especially now knowing what we know about the general Australian public. I should have allocated more time for it, definitely. The scenarios were really great as a teaching vehicle. And I think that could apply in so many contexts, sociology, psychology, whole host of ways that you could actually use that to explore the law, obviously, a whole range of ways to discuss it. I really was thinking a lot about how we discuss sensitive topics. Because I only teach criminal law, previously now criminology, I do give a trigger warning at the start of semester. I do a little bit later on in the semester, but I also say to my students, I really could probably give a trigger warning every time I open my mouth. Like, we're going to talk about difficult subject matter. There's no way of avoiding that. I gave one at the beginning of coming to meet with those students. I didn't, know those students at all. I didn't know what they were bringing to the course. And so it's really difficult to think about how do we talk about this sort of subject matter in ways that adequately acknowledges that they may have experienced something like this. And what was particularly, the final point, what was particularly difficult, not in this year's iteration where it was a specific focal point and the essay and whatnot, but the previous iteration of my course 2 years earlier, we were teaching online, and I had the students in the section on domestic violence. There's a domestic violence bench book, which is a court book for all judicial officers, and they had to go and read a section and then summarise it to the class. And because it's COVID, we're all teaching online, and we're in breakout rooms, and I've sort of allocated a few minutes to this one, and I was like, okay, I've got 3 or 4 what breakout rooms to go to or whatever. And a student I've never met in person says on the screen, wow, it wasn't until I read that section of the handbook, or bench book, that I realised that my last relationship was a controlling one. And I was like, oh, I don't quite know how to respond to this in this online environment, because I don't have the normal tools I would have. I teach, because of what I teach, I have students disclose experiences of physical and sexual violence and those sorts of things regularly, but I didn't have the kind of normal tools available to me. I thought, wow, this is really weird. I don't know, I followed up with her afterwards, but it just really drew to my attention how different it is in the online environment. So yeah, just thinking about if we're going to teach these things, how do we prepare students? How do we do it in an online setting? How do we do it if it's not part of difficult subject matter courses already? And how do we manage this for staff? Because I do notice, as someone who does teach in this area and is getting a lot of these disclosures, the university also has a duty of care not just to the students but to the staff. And if we're thinking, we need to be teaching in creative ways and cross-disciplinary ways, and we should be teaching coercive control in music and literature and this, that and the other, that is likely to have students talk to us more about their sorts of experiences, and then we need to make sure that we are also protected, those of us who do this teaching, and that we're able to support our students and support ourselves and each other. I don't know how we're going for time, but